everyone. Welcome to our December History Talks. Our last History Talks of 2024, which is quite hard to believe, honestly. We're so excited to have you all here with us today. My name is Olivia Moore. I am the Museum Assistant for the Lacey Museum. I'm also joined by Associate Curator Felicia, who will be moderating the virtual part of the presentation at the back of the room. We are delighted to have historian and author Deborah Ross with us for tonight's talk. She's going to be delving into newspaper articles, census data, and archives from early Thurston County to develop a picture of attitudes towards romance, marriage, and sexuality that surprisingly aren't too different from that today. For those of you here in person, if you haven't already, we'd really appreciate if you would sign in after the conclusion of tonight's event, as that helps us get an accurate count of attendance. You can also use that form to sign up for our newsletter, and we'll keep you posted about the current updates with regards to the museum. But before we begin tonight's programme, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement and some recent museum news. The Lacey Museum is on the ancestral land of the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek, including the Nisqually Indian Tribe and Squaxin Island Tribe. We acknowledge and remember those tribal people not recognized today and who were absorbed or relocated into other tribes for survival. We recognize the ancestors and their descendants who still live here. We recognize and respect the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek as the traditional stewards of this land since time immemorial, and their role today in taking care of these lands in perpetuity. We recognize and have the responsibility to call attention to the histories of dispossession, forced removal, and abridged treaty rights that allowed our nation, state, and city to develop as they have today. We recommend that community members read the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854. So I'm sure many of you have already heard the exciting news, but if you haven't, the Lacey Museum is moving location. The current museum located in the Russell House on Lacey Street closed last month on November 8th. The museum will reopen its new location on 6th Avenue at the Belltown Centre early next year. And don't worry, we will let you know as soon as we have a more specific date. We're really excited for you to see what we've been working on over the last few weeks. The existing museum location is still going to be in operation, but this will become a dedicated research centre where people can explore the museum library, archives, subject files, genealogy collections, and more. We also hope you'll join us next month for a history talk with Rebecca Sanchez on the Evergreen Ballroom. She'll be covering her research on a series of local history articles published on Thurston Talk about the once extremely popular venue that used to be located here in Lacey, and we're really looking forward to that event. Now, for tonight's presentation, we will hold our Q&A section at the end, and we'll do our best to get questions from both our in-person and our online attendees. For those online, if you have any questions for Deborah during the presentation, feel free to submit them in the Q&A bottom, and it's usually located at the bottom of your screen. For those of you in person, I will be walking around with a microphone at the end, so those watching live online will also be able to hear you. Now, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Deborah Ross. Deborah Ross has been researching and writing about Thurston County history for about 20 years. She serves on the editorial board of the Thurston County Historical Journal and produces the weekly Looking Back feature for the Sunday Olympian. She is also the research coordinator for the Olympia Historical Society and Bigelow House Museum and curates most of the content for its website. She lives at Panorama in Lacey with her husband, Brian Hovis. Thank you so much, Deborah, for joining us tonight. Thank you. There's the clicker. Thanks.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you for coming, those of you in person and those of you on the Zoom on this dark, dank December evening. So in August of this year, I had an article published in the Thurston County Historical Journal called First Comes Love, Attitudes Towards Romance, Love, and Sexuality in Early Thurston County. And there may or may not be some copies of this. There are. Copies of this available for you to purchase here, or if you're a member of the Lacey Historical Society or Olympia Historical Society, you can get one for free. So after reading this article, folks at the Lacey Museum invited me to come and share some of what I had found and what I had published in the article, and I'm talking to you a little bit about that today. Some of what I'm talking about is in the article, and some's not. You might find some, if you have read the article, there'll be some new material that I'm going to be covering today as well. I'm also often asked, well, how did you come up with ideas for what you wrote about, and where did you find the answers to the questions that you had? So at the end of my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available for researchers, largely online, but also some in person. So many of us grew up with a little song that we either sang to tease our friends or when we were jumping rope. And it goes like this. You can sing along with me if you like and substitute the couple that I'm going to be singing about. The song goes like this. Deb and Brian sitting in a tree, Kissing. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes a baby in a baby carriage. Well, you know what? We all know it doesn't always come in that order. Sometimes baby comes first, sometimes love, sometimes marriage. But we were all brought up to think that it was supposed to happen in that order. And when it doesn't, some of us say, it's time to make something again. Well, back in 1993, Evergreen professor Stephanie Coontz wrote a myth-shattering book entitled The Way We Never Were. And she said that love wasn't necessarily always part of marriage. In fact, it wasn't expected to be part of marriage. Babies didn't always come after marriage, and love didn't always come first. The idea that sex had to be only between married heterosexual people wasn't always the case, just like it always isn't now. So as I've been researching Thurston County history for about 20 years now, I've also run across accounts and articles and documents that paint a community that was far more diverse, as well as tolerant of residents who lived outside the norm of traditional households. So first, a couple of disclaimers. My focus is what Thurston County residents thought about sexuality, marriage, and family life, not necessarily as they in fact existed. Second, I'm not a social scientist, and I don't have a degree in history. So what I'm going to be talking about today is my findings from the research that I've done. And third, and perhaps most important, in early Thurston County, the vast majority of households were married couples, supplemented by children, staff, and boarders, or in remote areas, groups of men working in logging communities or the like. The cases I'm going to be talking about today then represent exceptions, and the reason I'm talking about exceptions is that attitudes towards those exceptions sheds light on how tolerant they were of those exceptions. So with that, let's turn first to the topic of love, or more narrowly, romance and sexuality, and even more narrowly, sex and romance outside of a heterosexual marriage. In early territorial days, of course, Olympia was one of the most important ports in Washington Territory, with a heavily male-dominated and transient population. Some estimates place the male-to-female ratio in the territory at 10-1. Well, when men arrived here, they had many needs: where to stay, where to eat, where to do their laundry, and of course, where to find female companionship. As early as 1860, Olympia had a nuisance ordinance that covered various unsavory activities, including sex work. And that ordinance is to be found in the Washington State Archives, and handwritten and signed by our forebear fathers of the city of Olympia. But it was widely known that the port area was mostly exempt from enforcement of the ordinance. More than one source says that typically a madam would pay a monthly fine of $20 that covered herself and 2 others. $5 per additional inmate was the going rate. The red light district was roughly bound by State Avenue, Columbia Street on the west, Washington on the east, and then the shoreline at what's now Thurston Avenue on the north. This Sanborn insurance map from 1891 shows the number of dwellings labeled femme boarding. That's a term used for a brothel in an area around what's the corner of State Avenue and Capitol Way. As an indication of how open, if not necessarily respectable or acceptable, sex work was, in the 1900 census, listed 12 women just in that neighborhood who self-described their occupation as prostitute. You can see that in the third column from the right. And of course, others were scattered around town. By 1909, however, the city had made plans to vastly extend its land base in the area to allow for industrial expansion. The red light district was disbanded and its population scattered. While it is fair to assume that sex work continued, it was no longer as open or tolerated as in the early territorial or statehood days. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the reasons for that later on in my talk. Well, now I'm going to turn to another example of romance or sex outside of heterosexual marriage, and that is romance between members of the same sex. Contrary to popular belief, if you define homosexuality as romantic attraction between members of the same sex, it has never been against the law in Washington Territory or state. In territorial days, there was no law against homosexuality at all. Then, in 1893, a law was passed prohibiting the practice of sodomy, generally meaning oral or anal sex between any 2 individuals or with animals. So far as I can tell, there have never been any prosecutions for lesbian sex. Indeed, Stephanie Coontz wrote that highly intense physical intimacy between women was common. She says that, quote, passionate female bonds frequently took precedence over relations within the nuclear family among women that would be thought scandalous by many in today's supposedly more broad-minded society. While there were never any prosecutions for lesbian sex, there were 2 widely publicized cases involving allegations of improper relations between 2 women. One involved well-known founder of the Olympia Women's Club, Abby Howard Hunt Stewart, pictured here. Abby was smart, outspoken, energetic, and unfeminine in traditional ways, wearing her hair short, as you can see, and it is said preferring men's clothing. When she died, she left most of her estate to 3 close female friends. Her brother challenged the will, claiming that she had come under the abnormal and unnatural influence of the legatees and producing passionate letters that Abby had written to them. He used the letters to assert that Abby was insane. The trial was widely attended, with spectators laughing knowingly when Abby's quirks were addressed. The brother lost, and it is clear that sympathy was with Abby. She was proclaimed to be shrewd but peculiar, but not insane. And my article gives another example of similar to this one, where an allegation of a same-sex romance was used, unsuccessfully again, to deprive an Olympia Brewing Company heiress of her fortune. And if we have time at the end with the Q&A, I can tell you a little bit more about that story. There are few examples of homosexuality among males reported in court cases or newspapers. I found 3 from Thurston County. 2 involve situations that would be criminal today, that is, sexual molestation of children. A 3rd poignant case involves Edward Claffey, who was accused without evidence of committing an unnatural crime involving minors. However, when no witnesses appeared at court, the case was dismissed. It appeared that his only unnatural activities were wearing his hair long and smoking opium, which wasn't in fact a crime. Nevertheless, he was hounded out of town, and his profile was shared with neighboring counties. Now I'm going to turn to my second topic, which is marriage. As Stephanie Coontz has demonstrated, marriage has, until very recent times, been more about stability in political and economic terms than about love. As the West began to be settled, the federal government enacted the Donation Land Claim Act to encourage settlement by immigrants to the West, and thereby strengthen the U.S.'s claim to the territory. The act included a strong incentive for marriage. Single men could initially claim 320 acres of land. But if they were married, there was an additional 320 acres available. Unusually, that extra acreage was to be held in the wife's name. The acreage was later reduced to 160 acres for a single man and an additional 160 acres for the wife. This map here shows the claims made in Thurston County under the Donation Land Claim Act, which extends to nearly all the developable land. And thus there was a strong incentive for men to marry either before they arrived in Thurston County or afterwards. And I should note here, as more than an aside and consistent with the land acknowledgement that we heard earlier today, that all of these claims were filed before any kind of treaty was established with the Native Americans who were already living here. The act did provide for negotiation of treaties with Native Americans, but there's no indication that settlers were concerned about their rights vis-a-vis existing residents, or had little fear that ultimately they would get title to the land. Another attempt to rectify the imbalance between men and women and promote marriage was more homegrown. In the 1860s, Asa Mercer of Seattle noted that while men far outweighed women in the West, the reverse was true in the East, partly because of the devastations of the Civil War. So he arranged for marriageable women to come to Washington Territory and settle. 11 women came in the first ship, with more in a second voyage. Several of the latter group settled here in Thurston County, and most did marry local men. Among them was the beautiful Annie Stevens, who's pictured here. However, her case did nothing to rectify the man-woman imbalance, since her husband, John Gowie, apparently divorced his first wife in order to marry Annie. At least the marriage took place only a few weeks after the divorce. While efforts such as the Donation Land Claim Act and the Mercer Girl Endeavor were intended to promote marriage, there were countervailing forces at work. One was that Washington Territory and later Washington State were among the few that adopted community property for wives, where wives could, and still do, claim half of a couple's property as their own. An interesting case involves Albertina Schneider, who arrived here with her husband, Conrad Schneider. The couple promptly filed a donation claim just south of today's airport, and then they later moved to West Olympia at the foot of Schneider Hill. After Conrad left Albertina to live on his own on Schneider Prairie north of here, Albertina filed a claim under the community property law, asserting her right to own the West Olympia property free of Conrad's claim. Her X mark on the filed claim, again available at Washington State Archives, reflects the fact that she was illiterate, and yet she was an astute businesswoman and farmer to the end of her life. Another phenomenon countervailing official policy of promoting marriage was the ease and widespread incidence of divorce. It was remarkably easy to obtain a divorce in Washington Territory, which had the highest rate of divorce in the country by 1900, up from fourth highest in 1870. It has been speculated that the ease of and financial incentive for marriage naturally led to many cases of spouses ending up divorced and separated, with the majority of the claimants being women. And now I'm going to turn to the third topic, the baby in a baby carriage. As with its encouragement of heterosexual marriage, the government and society in general were interested in promoting stable communities, anchored by households consisting of at least one breadwinner, generally the husband, and one household manager, generally the wife, before they welcomed children into the household. My conclusion from reading newspaper articles and lawsuits from early Thurston County is that there was a strong preference for a household with two parents over a single-parent household. Certainly, there were many cases of widowhood or other unavoidable situations, but deliberate or careless single parenthood was frowned upon. And I'm going to give 3 examples of that. Between 1890 and 1900, at least 8 babies were left on the doorstep of well-established childless couples, called the doorstep babies by the local press. While the identity of the human stork was never fully established, rumor was that it was Mrs. Harriet Henderson, pictured here, an evangelical Christian who was known to minister to the needs of members of the red light district, as there was no orphanage in the area. Another way to handle the problem of an unwanted pregnancy was, of course, abortion. Abortion was illegal in Washington Territory and Washington State until 1970. Nevertheless, it did exist covertly, with occasional gruesome accounts in the newspapers of abortions or other termination attempts gone wrong. Pictured here is Dr. Lucy Cook, whose medical practice was in the red light district. There are hints that Dr. Cook may have either assisted in pregnancy terminations or, in at least one case, tried to save the life of a young girl who had attempted one on her own. And finally, there were cases where a girl was forced to marry her seducer in order to legitimize her child. 2 such cases involved the girl's father bringing suit against the seducer to force him to marry his daughter, or at a minimum, requiring him to pay for the cost of rearing the child. One very well-publicized case involved a young man from a good family who actually was convicted of seduction and sent to the Walla Walla prison. The underage woman involved and her child were later lucky in that she later married another man who agreed to adopt the child. as Thurston County approached and then entered the 20th century, fluid notions of love, sexuality, and marriage started to solidify. It was increasingly considered that love was an indispensable element of a marriage, and that marital faithfulness of both men and women was a crucial part of civic life. Thus, sex work was increasingly marginalized and hidden, and Stephanie Coontz writes, the idea of love as a central element to a stable marriage and hence civil society became an accepted norm. Paradoxically, as it appears to us today, this insistence was part and parcel of the nascent women's rights movement. In Thurston County, this was exemplified by Mary Olney Brown, pictured here. Today, Dr. Brown is remembered as an ardent suffragist, one of the earliest voters, female voters in Thurston County. What is forgotten sometimes is her focus on the health of family and children. She waged war on brothels, observing that husbands who frequented them were all too often likely to bring venereal disease into a family. She argued that the quarantine laws covering people with transmittable diseases, which was really meant to cover things like tuberculosis, should apply to brothels as well as ships carrying other diseases, perhaps, like smallpox. She waged war on saloons because they were tempting venues for men who otherwise should be home with wife and children. Today, we think of women's rights as the right to pursue equal professions and otherwise participate in every aspect of civil life. And Dr. Brown wouldn't disagree with that. But she was ardently concerned with the preservation of the family as the best way to ensure women's health and security. So, what can we conclude from these peeks into attitudes towards love, marriage, and children? My conclusions are mixed. First, people of early Thurston County seem to feel that consensual sex among adults was none of their business, or the business of government, or pesky relatives. Second, residents seem to agree that in order for Thurston County to grow and thrive, it was a good idea to promote marriage as a source of household stability. The right of women to own land, to live separately from their husbands, and occasionally engage in a profession was supported by law as well as social practice from very early on. Third, there was a strong feeling that children should be born into, or at least grow up in, a family headed by two parents wherever possible. And finally, lest you be left with the impression that love and marriage were entirely separate concepts in early Thurston County, here is a sweet story for you. Christopher C. Simmons, the son of Michael T. Simmons, and Asenath Ann Kennedy were sweethearts from childhood. When they eloped, when Asenath Ann was 14 years old and CC 19 years old, Asenath Ann put a little slip of paper inside her shoe with the number 18 written on it. When the minister asked her if she was over 18, she truthfully replied, yes. The picture it left was taken shortly after their marriage. The one at right is their 60th anniversary celebration with their dozens of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren around them. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about where I find my sources and how others can do their own research. And so here are some of the main ones. First, almost all of my research for this article was done from the comfort of my own home, either reading online sources or getting books out of the library. And here are some that I rely on very regularly. The Ancestry.com website has millions or maybe billions of resources for people to research their own family and other people. An example is the census document that I showed you at the beginning of my talk. The website is available by subscription, but you can also get it for free if you go to the Timberland Library or the Washington State Library. Newspapers are a terrific way to get an idea of what is happening at a particular time. Much better, in my opinion, than reading a book where the author or some speaker filtered events through their own lens. Folks with a Timberland or State Library card can read all of the Olympians online for free, and many more newspapers, and search by name or subject. It is a hard resource to find, so if you are looking for that, just contact me and I'll try to wade you through how to get there. The Washington State Archives, as I've said previously, has deeds, lawsuits, pretty much anything official. You do generally have to visit there in person, but the staff are incredibly helpful, and it's really a wonderful place to go to put your finger on these actual pieces of paper that are kept there. This is where I found Albertina Schneider with her ex, and as well as the ordinance governing nuisances that I showed you earlier. The Olympia Historical Society and Bigelow House Museum has a fabulous website with an excellent and extensive set of resources, including interactive maps, mostly created by my husband, Brian Hovis, online documents, photographs, which I curate and maintain. The image of Harriet Henderson, for example, is from Rebecca Christie's book, Working Man's Hill, which is entirely online at the Olympia Historical Society's website. The Washington State Historical Society has a pretty good online catalog of photographs and documents in their huge sprawling collection. You can visit their research center by appointment and look at originals there in Tacoma. And so with that, I am happy to take any questions or comments or observations. I look forward to talking with you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If anyone in the audience has any questions, sure.
Done.
Just bring the microphone over.
Thinking of some other resources, historical books about Thurston County and stuff, do you think the fact that it was the state capital and hosted the legislature every other year at that time had any impact on the character of the community in terms of what you've talked about tonight?
Insofar as there was an active port that would have brought legislators to and from, and the legislators and other staff people also required lodging and restaurants. Yes, for sure. In terms of the topics that I'm talking about, I don't know about that. I'm not sure whether, it's a good question to think about, is whether our county had a kind of a different attitudes towards some of these topics than in other counties.
Anyone else?
Let me see, I have to look what it was called. I wondered if you knew when the donation land claims, the time period, and did the Homestead Act later apply to our area?
Okay. I don't have the exact dates, but the question is whether the donation, what the years were for the Donation Land Claim Act, and then whether the Homestead Act also applied to allow people to claim in our area. I think the Donation Land Claim Act was something like 1851, and the legislation provided that you could get the 320 per, for the husband, another 320 for the wife, if they were married by, I think, the end of 1851. And then after that, it went to 160 for a husband, 160 for the wife. And that, I believe, lasted for about 4 years, something like that. And then the Homestead Act took its place. And by the way, the Homestead Act did not have a provision for wives getting their separate land. Single women, if they were widowed, they could claim under the Homestead Act. And yes, it would have applied to anything in Thurston County as well.
We do have a question online. What is the oldest year for a census you found that listed prostitute for an occupation?
I only went back as far as 1870. The censuses before that didn't really have as much information, so you get more and more information as the years go by. And I think that that prostitute, that was the only one that I noticed where people listed their profession. However, I should say that dressmaker and seamstress were well-known euphemisms for prostitution. And in fact, Olympia had a very large percentage of people who listed themselves as seamstresses or dressmakers, way more than would actually be required for the size of the population. So one can speculate that there were quite a few more who didn't outwardly acknowledge their profession.
Is there any more questions from the in-person audience? Okay.
Deb, how would you summarize the differences, if any, I'm sure there are some, between attitudes on your topics then and now?
Well, I think in terms, the easiest one is single parenthood, because I think nowadays it's just not considered nearly as horrible a thing as it would have been back then. And I think part of that is that women's options were so limited back in early Thurston County. And so if you can imagine, a single woman raising a child, you just wouldn't want to do it if you had any other option. Your sources of profession and income are very limited. So it's understandable that there would be a strong emphasis on having a two-parent household. As far as sexuality, it's really also hard to tell because we're far more open about different expressions of sexuality than there were back then. If you look at census information, there were plenty of households with 2 women, plenty with 2 men, but they're not going to list, if they had a sexual relationship, they're not going to list that in a census document. So it's really hard to tell what was accepted and what wasn't, except when you come across these court cases or filings, and that's why I call this talk attitudes rather than instances, because the newspaper accounts and the court cases shed a light on what people thought about types of behavior that come to their attention.
We have an online question, then I'll go back to the audience. Thank you.
We actually have 2 people online that are curious to know about the Olympia Brewery heiress story.
Okay. Let me just get her name right here. Okay. Her name was Harriet Speckart, and Harriet's mom was related to the Olympia Brewing Company Schmidt family. And so some funds were set aside for her in trust that she would inherit when she became of age. And in the meantime, she entered into a relationship with a doctor, Dr. Marie Equi, who was from Portland. Their relationship was definitely a same-sex relationship. They went so far as to adopt a little girl who called her two mothers Ma and Da. And so when Harriet became of age, the mother, again, like in the case of Abby Howard Hunt Stewart, claimed that Harriet was basically under an unnatural influence by Dr. Marie Equi, and then she should not be given her inheritance. But the parents lost in court again. In that case, the population of Olympia seemed to be pretty evenly divided between sympathy for Harriet and sympathy for the mom, mostly because they thought Harriet had been influenced when she was a very young girl, and that perhaps that influence was improper. So that's the story of Harriet.
When you were doing the research about this period, was there any overlap or discussion between the Red District, I guess you called it?
Red Light District?
Yeah, and Little Hollywood and the Chinese community?
That's a good question. Little Hollywood was an area that was developed. Actually, it started way back. It had always existed, a little settlement where Capitol Lake is now. It had always existed in the form of float houses and other temporary structures there. I have done some work on the kind of people who were living in Little Hollywood. Most of them were working people. Some were older people, but they were definitely living on the margins. It's hard to know if any of the former residents of the Red Light District moved to Little Hollywood. Little Hollywood really started expanding, though, during the Depression. So that would have been, a couple of decades after the Red Light District was cleared out. But certainly, I'm sure that sex work existed throughout Olympia after the clearance. It just wasn't so visible.
We have another question online. Deborah, through your research, did you find any signs of trans or non-binary people living in Thurston County?
It's hard to know. I think, as I said, there's plenty of households that are headed or exclusively two women living together or two men living together, but they're not going to put down in the census form that they're trans or non-binary. If you look at Abby Howard Hunt Stewart, who liked to wear her hair short and dress like a man, who knows whether she was lesbian, bi. I mean, she was married, so I suppose you'd say that she was bi, at least. But it's impossible to know whether she identified as a man or just identified as a bisexual or a lesbian woman at this point.
One other thought, looking at your census information there on the screen, is what was the size of the community at, say, around statehood, 1889?
I may have that here. Let's see. It would have been, I can't find it right offhand, but it would have been probably 4,000 or 5,000. At least, yeah, at least in Olympia, and then greatly expanded with statehood.
We have another question online. Do you happen to know if there was single women housing / boarding houses in the Olympia area that might be a safe place for women who were involved in same-sex relationships to live together while appearing to be roommates, therefore perhaps feeling safer?
There were certainly plenty of households headed by two women, and as Stephanie Coontz notes, it just wasn't considered improper for two women to have intense relationships. And, even married women, the husband would go off to into the woods, and girlfriend would come and they'd cuddle up together. So I think that it was far more acceptable, unless there was money involved, for women to do whatever women wanted to do, and it was their business and nobody else's business. So I'd say that any household was probably safe, because it just wasn't considered out of the ordinary or frowned upon.
Do we have any more questions from the audience at all? Any online? Okay. Well, I think that concludes tonight's presentation. Thank you so much, Deborah, again.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. We really hope to see you in the new year for our next history talk. So thank you. Have a good rest of your evening.